Hello everybody, this is Dr. Flight and we have a video uh, conversation here that deals with marketing research studies. And so the idea is that occasionally you'll have a specific question, a specific problem maybe, or something you want answered that is not an ongoing regular piece of decision making that you're making. And so as a result, you want to engage in a research project that simply answers one specific question. That's when we use a marketing research study. So what we'll talk about is a series of steps or a process that researchers go through in order to conduct a marketing research study. And we'll jump into that right now, but that's the essence of this conversation. If you have any questions or if you have any comments or whatnot, please reach out to me. Thanks. All right, so the marketing research study concept. Oftentimes, nonprofits are more restricted in their resources, especially in their research budget. So being very focused is important in terms of developing a research plan for the nonprofits who need to use their money judiciously when they think about their marketing budget and their research budget in general. So make sure the goal of the research is clear and that research will only help a very specific question. That's one of the keys here in terms of using research and your research dollars appropriately. Be sure, again, as a nonprofit or any small business or entrepreneur, that you remember that research costs both money and time. Time is needed to do a research project properly, and so you don't want to jump into a project without that in mind. Finally, we want to make sure that this research is planned. It's a planned process. So we have a series of steps that are used when we do a research project. The more planning that is done, the better. So 80 to 90% of research is actually done in the planning process, where we think through what we're going to do in terms of collecting data and analyzing data. The actual collecting and analyzing part doesn't really make up a large portion of the research that, kind of time commitment, but it's the planning that's important. If you plan right, then the results will generally follow suit. Now, there's a whole bunch of steps here. The text it has 12 different pieces that are to the puzzle. You can refer back to these steps if you want. We're going to talk a little bit about each one of these. It's not uncommon to see a series of research steps that are maybe 10 or 11 or maybe even shorter, like 4 or 5 or 6. 12 steps, means that there's a lot of detail in each step, but that's kind of the process laid out here. So again, we'll walk through each of these kind of as we go. You can use this screen though as a referral or as a study tool, a study aid, if you want to test yourself to remember what each one of these is for. As we move forward, we want to keep a couple key points in mind about doing research and a research process. Number one, there's nothing really special about 12 steps. As I just mentioned, there are some research processes that take fewer. 12, I think, is the most I've ever seen in terms of steps being laid out. I've seen a 6-step process. I've seen an 11-step process. Those are fairly common, but there's nothing necessarily special about 12 steps. In fact, not all studies will use 12 steps, even if you have delineated those. Some use fewer, which is important to know. Few studies indeed follow all the steps in precise order as well. Sometimes you work through a few of the steps in a research project and then you have to backtrack and do some over again, or you accelerate the process and you move through some steps very quickly. Sometimes researchers, again, use a 5-point outline or a shortened step or approach. That's perfectly fine to do as long as you understand that all of these 12 things are done They're just subsumed into other research steps if we do that. So if I were to lay this out in a 5-step program, I do IDing key research questions as a major function that you do, determining the method and design of the process, IDing appropriate samples and collecting the data analysis process, and then reporting and implementing. So again, if you were to take the 12 steps and if you wanted to consolidate them, it would be perfectly fine to do so into a more manageable set of processes, maybe 5 as are indicated here. Starting though, steps 1 through 3, determining the key decisions to be made, determining what information will be needed, and then consulting and verifying with managers. Those can be done more or less together. Have a managerial implication concept that's happening here. As managers, we ask big questions like what do we want to know, what customers we want to deal with, or who we should try to attract, how will demand fluctuate, how effective is our advertising, and things like this. So you got to sit down with managers and talk to them and ask them specifically what is the information that they need to know to be able to answer these questions. And very importantly, early on here in this process, right now, we could even ask, do we need to conduct research in the first place? So if you sit down and talk with the managers, you'll get a better understanding of what they need to know in order to make a decision. And if you already have the answers to this, then you don't need to do research. But this sit down with your client, if you will, the manager who's going to use your research, it answers a lot of questions and it helps the planning process. From this discussion, the most important thing you're going to come away from is the definition of the problem. So within this first 3 steps here, you got to define the actual problem that's being solved, that the manager has. If you don't do this, then much of the work that you do in the research process could very well be wasted work. You may have to redesign your research. You may have to redesign, and it'll impact the methods you use, the sample that you choose, the analytical approach that you take, and the reporting process. So remember, when you do these first few steps, the beginning of the process here, when you sit down with the manager who's going to use the data or the report that you produce, make sure you understand why they want your information, why they want the research done, and what the key problem is that you're looking to answer for them. If not, the project will be doomed for disaster. It will not turn out very good. So moving on, we also think about after defining the problem, what the actual research objectives will be. So this is kind of an interesting one, because we know that the manager has objectives in their job, but what would the research objectives be? They are typically focused on specifically what the researcher will do and how they will specifically do it. So we want to be able to collect data using a survey. We want to analyze it using some statistical analyses. We want to create a report. So my objectives then will be to collect data, identify a sample, do some statistical analysis, and complete a report. If I don't do those things, then I will not have done my job as a researcher, thus I will not have reached my research objectives. So when we talk about from a researcher's point of view, outline what you need to do in order to do the research project. That moves us into the middle part of the steps, the research design concepts. So determining an analysis design, or what we sometimes call a research plan, deciding on our data collection methods and designing a questionnaire. We also want to explore other forms of data that may also be available to us. Inside this area of research, inside these steps, we may think about the different types of research that are possible to be done. We have something called exploratory research, which is research that we do primarily with secondary data. We look to find information that already exists about my problem. That's what exploratory research is all about. Descriptive research uses statistics to describe the sample or describe the objects of interest using statistical methods. So we look for averages and we look for variances and we look for statistical ways to describe our subjects that we're studying. Causal research, also thought of as experiments, is a third level or degree of research. And in causal research, we look to form relationships in a cause and effect manner between variables. So we're looking to establish relationships between variables, not just simply describing them or just understanding them, but rather show how they're related to each other. Okay, so that's, kind of the area here, this 4, 5, and 6 area really is, again, it's a planning process, but it plans out how research will be done and the methods that will be used to collect data and, what form of research we're going to pursue. That brings us up to 7, 8, and 9. So steps 7, 8, and 9. Which would include determining your sample size and implementing research study, collecting the data, and also analyzing the data. So we use a number of different analysis techniques, usually focused on statistics or qualitative analysis or qualitative data. We need to identify how many respondents we will need, how many people we'll need to collect data from, what our sample size, and we'll also need to identify where the sample will come from and if the sample, how representative the sample is of the population. So we actually put a lot of thought and time and effort into thinking about how we will access our sample and making sure that the sample represents the population or the market that we're actually focused on and worried about. The other issue here is how many respondents we're going to need, what our sample size will be. There are calculations for us to do that. Like, for instance, as a general rule, you want 5 respondents for every question that you ask in a survey. That's a rule of thumb, but again, there are other more sophisticated ways to calculate sample size. But we need to know how many respondents we should expect to need to provide reliable and valid data. Collecting the data, there's a number of steps that we think about when we do the collection process. So we want to physically actually collect the data. We want to make sure that the survey instrument is reliable and accurate and true. We want to test the survey instrument beforehand. We also want to consider how the data is actually collected, whether, for instance, we use an online instrument or a face-to-face instrument, whether we're asking the respondent questions or we're letting the respondent use questions on their own, whether we're using a telephone and collecting data that way, and so forth. So there are a number of different methods used to actually go out and collect data. And we want to make sure, again, that data is reliable and valid. Once you collect the data, there's going to be a certain amount of error associated with it, which we would call sampling error, because of the fact that we're using a sample and we're gathering data from the general population. So researcher must then adhere to our research plan to ensure the data is valid. We may have to collect more data if the original data was not collected properly. So this is a step where we do a lot of data validation to make sure that the right people answered the right questions and that everything was agreeable and follows the plan that we had set initially. Also within this category, we have analyzing the data or data analysis. So we need to make sure that the data that was collected was entered into a spreadsheet or into some type of software. We're going to analyze the data for mistakes. Sometimes we call this data cleaning. So we want to look at the data that was collected, and we want to look for anomalies or problems that suggest the data was not collected correctly or that the questions did not perform the way they were supposed to. We were going to run tabulations. We're going to run this data for statistical analysis, and we're also going to test hypotheses. If we're doing causal research, we're certainly testing for statistical significance, and we're testing for hypotheses to either prove or disprove or whatnot, to find evidence of a model or a relationship between variables. We're also, though, running averages and the descriptive statistics that we would normally look at anyways or as well. That leads us up to the very last portion of the process, steps 10, 11, and 12, where we're writing a report. We're meeting back with the manager to talk about how the results specify the original problem that was noted, and we evaluate our process for conducting the research project to begin with. So the assumption here is that you do research on a regular basis and you do multiple projects, and your process for doing research is one that you want to improve over a period of time. So evaluating the research process that you engaged in allows you opportunities to come better and better and better as a researcher in general. So we need to create a report or a presentation, and we need this done in the context of the audience who's going to be seeing or hearing it, which will probably be the manager of the nonprofit. We want to allow this information to be transmitted in simple terms where the information is described in a way that solves the manager's problem, which we established way back in steps 1, 2, and 3. We may, and I emphasize may here, offer remedies or additional insights to the firm, but we want to be careful not to overstep our reach. Our job is to be a researcher, to collect data, and to provide results. We may be asked to analyze the results in the context of the firm, but we may also just leave that up to the manager to do that as well. So this is a real quick walkthrough of the 12-step process. There's obviously a lot of emphasis and time placed on each of these steps that we don't have here, but it gives you a flavor for what a research project is all about if you have a specific problem. Keep in mind that a huge portion of the research process is actually done in the planning process, where you think through what you want to do and why you want to do it from a research perspective. 89 to 90% of the research is in the planning. So you have to be willing to invest the time and the money and the effort in the planning process to answer specific questions. Remember, there are exploratory, descriptive, and causal types of research when we think about research design. There's no right number of steps in a research project. Sometimes we skip steps, sometimes we repeat steps, sometimes you consolidate steps from 12 down to 5, for instance, and that makes things better, if that's the type of work that you're engaged in. Big key here is that research done properly is designed to produce valid and reliable results. So please emphasize this, that if you're not doing, if the research you're producing is not valid, if it doesn't reflect reality, in other words, and if it's not reliable, so if it's not consistent with expectations, then you run into real problems in trying to solve managers' problems. Or answering the questions that managers ultimately have. So this idea that planning is the key is the key. That's we can't forget to be able to do that, because if we don't plan initially, then the results we get are not going to be ones that we can trust to be accurate in helping our problem out. Okay, so This has been a rundown then of a research project concept in terms of doing market research. There are other types of research, ongoing research, for instance, that's done with a marketing information system or marketing knowledge system. This type of research, though, is project specific and problem specific as well. And so it's offered for you and for managers to be able to tap into as needed. All right, so make sure you're reviewing the text and the concepts that we have here. Ask me if you have any questions. Reach out to me. I look forward to hearing from you. And anyways, have a great rest of your day. I'm glad you had a chance to listen to this.